Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 23rd edition of Stay at Home, a video education series from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Bhaskar Sankara. I'm the editor and publisher of Jacobin Magazine. And almost every day at 6 p.m. Eastern, me or another Jacobin host has been joined by a left-wing thinker that has given a lecture of sorts for 25, 30 minutes on a provocative topic. Then we've been doing live chats in our YouTube kind of chat. So if you want to participate, just make sure you're signed in, and you can drop questions to our speaker tonight as he's speaking. So basically, we've been doing these because a lot of us are holed up in relative isolation at our homes. This is a good time to convince people to appear on video because it's very hard for people to duck you. Like Jared, for instance, our guest tonight, said he might have some other plans. I told him, no, you probably don't have plans because it's Monday at 6 p.m. You don't have shit to do. And he agreed to do it. And then obviously one of our points is, our goal is to build a left that isn't just about agitation, that's also about obviously the real work of political organizing, but the substantive work of political education. And every day, Jacobin publishes 7 pieces on our website. Many of those are just about the injustices of the capitalist system. They're reaching a really broad audience of a couple million people some month, explaining why the current system is unjust and explaining why there's an alternative. But what we try to do with the print issue, what we try to do with our pamphlets and our books, what we try to do with this video education series is offer a slightly deeper, longer form take on a particular topic with the idea that these talks should be both accessible, but also really cause socialists to ask some hard questions. And later this week, we have a bunch of really great talks. We have Dustin Gostella on the really undemocratic nature of the US political system and how we can fight to have working class political representation given those constraints. We have Mike McCarthy on where capitalists get their power from, both at economic and a political level, what resources are at their disposal, and how we can fight back. And then on Thursday, we have Kate Arnoff, who's giving a talk on the Green New Deal. On Friday, we have Dan Finn. This is kind of the by date, the anniversary of the Easter Rising, 1916 Easter Rising. So we have Dan Finn giving a brief history of Irish republicanism and what a socialist perspective on Irish republicanism is. Then on Saturday, we have the 3rd edition of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. And we also have Catarina Principe, one of our comrades from Portugal, who will, on the anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, the revolution in Portugal that overthrew the authoritarian Salazar regime, give a talk about the significance of the Carnation Revolution, the only real modern revolution that took state power in a Western country, and talking about how radical that revolution could have been, what it actually accomplished as far as decolonization and the rest, but also what were some of the unfulfilled socialist promises of that revolution. So these are really interesting topics. They're from a host of speakers that are giving their time. Obviously, we're all kind of pitching in. We have Cale Brooks producing it. We have a bunch of Jacobin people, not just myself, hosting these. So our only ask for all this work is just you press subscribe and you press like on the YouTube channel. This isn't just for our vanity, so we can see lots of thumbs ups and stuff like that. It's because these likes and subscribes kind of convinces the YouTube algorithm to deliver this to more people. And obviously our goal isn't just to speak to a small base of already converted Jacobin readers and socialists, but to expand our audience and to take what's kind of a den of reaction, some parts of YouTube at least, and really make it into a place where socialists can have vibrant arguments and discussions and can reach this wider audience. So tonight, I'm joined by Jared Abbott. Jared is a long time DSA member. There what is over 60,000 people in DSA, and I imagine 55,000 of them at least, maybe 56,000 of them have joined after Jared Abbott, and he's still a young man. But that's I think testament to how long he's been around, both YDS, Young Democratic Socialists, and DSA. He's a frequent contributor to Jacobin and Catalyst. In Jacobin, he had a series of, I think, two long articles with Dustin Gostella, and he had one as well on the, I guess, second to last issue of Catalyst. And both articles focused on political strategy for the socialist left, given the constraints that we face as far as our really undemocratic political party system and the constraints as far as ballot lines. So, what would it mean to create, as the title of the Catalyst article puts it, a socialist party in our time? And Jared and Dustin, by the way, is speaking tomorrow, kind of continuing on Jared's argument, both laid out this idea of a party surrogate. And I think it's a really fascinating idea. I think Jared has a lot to say about where the potential is, where the potential breakthroughs we could have on the American political left right now, but also why we're not living up to our potential. When we published this piece by Jared in our last issue, it seemed like the whole thrust of the issue was Bernie Sanders is probably going to win the nomination of the Democratic Party, or it's a real possibility. And now we have to figure out how we build a base from that starting point of having a Democratic Socialist at the White House using the bully pulpit of the White House, and how we resist the power of capital, how we resist capital flights and capital strikes and capitalists withholding investment, how we resist all the dirty tricks that they'll be able to use in both the state and economy against us. We thought that was the challenge. And I think the last month or two have been very sobering for socialists, because we realize that our challenge isn't just this, but it's also building the popular audience to begin with. It's also building a majority support for not necessarily our key legislative priorities in the short term that already have support by and large, but building the kind of coalition that can actually win, and win both against the forces of the liberal center and, of course, the even more dangerous forces of the authoritarian right. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Jared, who's going to talk for around 25 minutes or so. And then after that, we're going to have this Q&A. So please press like, press subscribe, and leave Jared your questions in the chat as he's speaking. And I'll talk to you all in 25 minutes. But go ahead, Jared. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks, Bhaskar. It's great to talk with everybody. So yeah, I'm going to talk about this idea of the party surrogate, where we go from here after the Bernie campaign and then the age of the coronavirus. I just want to preface this all by saying what should be pretty obvious, but I mean, in general, at this point, we can't begin to predict the effects of this crisis on the left's political fortunes in a serious way. There's just way too much uncertainty, and we're just trying to meet overwhelming immediate needs before we can even get to a point where things are even approaching clear in terms of what political strategy will look like for us in the coming period. But so with all that said, I mean, I think it's still worthwhile to have this conversation, but we should do it humbly and tentatively as we sort of start to think through, where the left is after Sanders and where we might go from here. So I just want to, start with that. Now, I think the first thing that we should recognize also is that, this crisis currently is going to pose major challenges, probably unprecedented challenges for our movement, from the basic goals of or needs of just ensuring that our comrades, friends, families, and communities are able to get through this crisis at a very basic level, to the very real and growing threats of the radical right. And this is all bracketing the fact that, unlike during the Great Depression, where the Democrats controlled the presidency as well as both houses of Congress, the odds of us getting any of our major legislative priorities through Congress in the next session are not very high. So all that said, and I know that's a lot, I still think that thanks to what the Sanders campaign has built, together with a number of new political possibilities that are clearly going to be opening up in light of this sort of ongoing tragic mismanagement of the corona crisis by the Trump administration, we're now in a moment of potential opportunity for the left that I think could actually amplify a lot of the already existing sort of political and social dynamics that were working in our favor before the crisis, and which really helped Sanders perform so well in 2016 and in 2020. And so basically, I see three broad sets of opportunities for the left right now that I want to just go through before sort of talking about some of the challenges and what the sort of party surrogate might be and look like. First, there has been a major abandonment of the Democratic Party by the working class over the past 40 years. And this has left an increasingly large group of unaffiliated potential voters who are very open to a progressive or even democratic socialist alternative that we can build upon to build a new constituency for the type of electoral politics that we're talking about. I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail in a minute, but I just want to give a brief preview. Second, there's been a lot of new organizational infrastructures that have been built over the last few years in terms of political, electoral organizations, union organizations, social movement organizations, that could actually provide the material and financial resources to get a serious electoral project for socialists off the ground for the first time in a really long time. And finally, there's just an unprecedented level of support, well, at least unprecedented in the last, say, 50 years, for a wide range of Sanders-style policies that could serve as the political foundation or platform for a new socialist electoral project. And this support for things like the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, housing for all, et cetera, is only going to balloon as this crisis deepens and as millions around the country and the world, of course, begin to see that establishment politics that have been offered by the Democratic Party simply are not up to the task of dealing with this crisis. So getting into a little bit more detail about each of these, the working class, as we probably all know and have experienced in our own lives, has been facing massively increasing levels of austerity and neoliberalism over the last 30 years, which have gutted social services and our sort of welfare state such as it was. And this has led to declining living standards across the board for the working class. And this is only going to intensify and has already intensified over the last month as working people in this country and around the world, working and poor people, are going to bear the brunt of neoliberal savage cuts to all the basic standards of living that we all need to get by. And meanwhile, as the working class's standards of living have been going down during this period of neoliberalism, the Democratic Party establishment, the leaders of the party have basically been unwilling or unable to do much to help working people. And this has led to a pretty serious decline in support for the Democratic Party among the working class. And Cale, I don't know if you can put up that slide there, which is just a graph. You can see here that in 1982, about 50% of the working class, I mean, if somebody has a question, I can explain like how we've calculated what the working class is, but generally speaking, identified with the Democratic Party. Whereas in 2018, that was less than 30%. So this is a major decrease that was happening even before the crisis. And it means that basically today, about 20% of Americans are working class, political independents who don't, according to public opinion surveys, don't lean toward the Republicans. And so that would mean that they would be open to the kind of project that democratic socialists or that Sanders-style politics that we're promoting. And since we know that about 50% of independents tend to not vote, this means that if a left-wing electoral project could mobilize a significant percentage of those non-voting independents into a new electoral project, it would represent a sea change in the Democratic Party electorate, especially in the primary electorate. Remember, only about 14% of Americans voted in the Democratic Party primaries in 2016, and probably something similar to that will be the case in, well, less now actually, sorry, in 2020. And if these folks, these sort of non-voting, infrequent working class voters were to get involved in electoral politics, and if we add that to the existing roughly 30% of the Democratic Party base that already sort of identifies as Bernie-crats or Sanders-style Democrats, this would provide Democratic Socialists a very substantial base that we could use to take down neoliberal Democrats in primary races all across the country at all levels. Okay, so we don't know what's going to happen going forward, but it's very likely that this trend of defection from the Democratic Party, is not going to subside, and indeed could accelerate if the Democratic Party remains unable to respond to the crisis by offering a dramatic pro-working class Sanders-style agenda to deal with the crisis. And if the leaders of the Democratic Party don't do that, we're going to see even more folks open to alternatives, outsider alternatives, like those that we're offering as a socialist or progressive left. Okay, so beyond sort of the fact that there's more and more sort of working class folks out there that are open to a project like that of Sanders and DSA and the broader sort of democratic socialist electoral universe that's out there in the United States, we've seen a huge ramping up of sort of just the organizations that could carry out this work on the ground in the last few years. So DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, when I joined, whatever it was, 10 years ago, I think we had maybe 5,000 or 6,000 members. Now that's up to, I don't know, 60,000, something like that, just in the last few years. We have organizations like Justice Democrats who have successfully gotten, 6 or 7 folks into Congress in the last 2 years. Our Revolution, these are both sort of, post-Sanders groups from 2016 that have, won races for progressive Sanders-style candidates all around the country. I would say even groups like Indivisible, which was, much more of a liberal sort of anti-Trump focused protest group. It's been training thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of folks all around the country to become activists and to become politically engaged, many for the first time over the past few years. And many of those folks, even if Democratic Socialists might think maybe, they're folks in Indivisible are not, Democratic Socialists per se, a lot of them are open to our sort of politics. In fact, I've seen DSA chapters start out of the ruins of inactive Indivisible chapters. And so we're just seeing this huge increase in the number of sort of activists that are out there that could be activated into this sort of electoral project through the Bernie campaign and through all these organizations that I just mentioned. And we're also seeing an increase in union militancy for the first time in quite a long time. Last year we saw, a huge increase. I mean, obviously we're starting from a relatively low level, as you can see here, but we saw a major increase in union militancy for the first time in decades, especially among the teachers in different parts of the country. And even right now, we're seeing, a surge in union actor in workplace disruption through strikes, as Amazon warehouse workers go out on strike, as Instacart workers and public sector workers of all different kinds. So we might actually be seeing, signs of increasing militancy among sort of rank and file union members, which could make the union's leadership of many progressive unions more open than they have been in the past, because they tend to be pretty risk averse to offering resources or support to a new kind of electoral formation. We're not talking about all major unions, but maybe more progressive unions, as they become pressured by their base to do so, would be open to supporting something like what we're talking about. And we would need union support to get something like this off the ground, because they have a lot of resources, and we need a lot of resources to be successful in a socialist electoral project. And finally, our politics, the politics of democratic socialism, are really, really, really popular. Even before the Corona crisis started, just pick the issue. A solid, majority backed Medicare for all. I mean, it depends on how you word the question, but a solid majority. You saw, depending on the question, between 50 and 70% of Americans favored increasing taxes on the rich. You saw 50, 60% support for making higher education free for all. You saw twice as many people in public opinion surveys saying that they think unions should have more influence rather than less than they currently do, which were very high levels relative to the last few decades. You saw even nearly a majority of Americans supporting a Green New Deal after being told that it would include historically, massive increases in government spending. And now, with the Corona crisis, as Americans are seeing that our politics are not just possible, but in fact, they're just sort of necessary, basic, common sense solutions that we need to get through this crisis. our politics are going to become even more popular. And so you can see here, just to give you a sense, I think this is from Data for Progress. I think they did this survey just last week. I mean, you're seeing, huge numbers of Americans favoring massive expansions in federal programs aimed at addressing the crisis, from universal paid sick leave and Medicare expansion to universal basic income. And these are actually majorities in almost all cases in this graph here, both of Democrats and Republican voters. And nearly 60% of Americans here were in support of canceling all student debt. So the popularity of the Sanders program and of democratic socialist politics in general is not just high, but it's only going to get more and more popular. Unfortunately, as this crisis, well, fortunately for us, but it's unfortunate, obviously, that the crisis makes all of this stuff even more necessary in the lives of all Americans. All that said, and not even addressing the fact that the crisis will certainly force democratic socialists and progressives of all kinds to fight a lot of defensive battles against both the right and centrist Democrats. When we look at the tally of democratic socialist electoral victories as of 2020, it's clear that we're not doing amazingly well. In fact, we've seen only limited successes. So to give you a sense, our revolution ran 28 candidates for Congress in 2018. 7 of them won. Just as Democrats ran 60 candidates in 2018. 6 of them won. 2 members of DSA were elected to Congress. Now, it's important to bracket all that and say these are, relatively speaking, really impressive numbers, because progressives and democratic socialists were much weaker, not just in Congress, but also in state houses and in municipal chambers and mayor office before the last few years. But that said, in objective terms, we're not really doing that great. Like if you combine all of the numbers of folks that these groups I've just mentioned, of their candidates that got into Congress in 2018, that's about 8. Compare that to the Tea Party, when their freshman class in 2010 had 39 House reps and 5 senators, right? And we tallied up all of the elected officials that DSA has, that our revolution has, and that the Working Families Party has, and we divided that number by the number of elected officials in the country, and it turns out that progressives and democratic socialists control about 0.01% of elected offices in the United States. So we have a ways to go, and this really begs the question of why are we still at this sort of low level? Why are we still losing in objective terms, even though we're doing better in relative terms over the last 2 years, given all these opportunities and the sort of propitious climate for democratic socialist electoral organizing? There's a lot of different factors I could focus on, and Dustin tomorrow is going to focus on some of those that I don't cover tonight. So particularly about the sort of structure of the U.S. electoral system, and how it's not very conducive to third parties and sort of outsider politics in general. But I'm going to focus on 2 factors right now that I think are really important to explain sort of like what the challenge we face is and why it's been so hard for us to win more than we have so far. The first one is the extreme difficulty in voter mobilization, or bringing new voters into the electorate. And the second one, which I want to talk about for a few minutes, is the obstacles imposed by the Democratic Party itself, which I believe, we can obviously debate about this, but I believe will be the main arena of electoral struggle for our candidates in the foreseeable future. That is, in the Democratic Party primaries. So I want to talk about these 2 challenges in turn for a little while. So the first thing to mention about voter mobilization, or trying to get new voters to come out and participate in electoral politics, a lot of people, including Bernie obviously himself, thought, this is how Bernie could win. This is how Sanderistas, can win elections, is to expand the electorate into those sort of non-voting, infrequent voters, working class folks that I was talking about, who are disillusioned with American politics and think, there's just no reason to participate because they've been sort of just lied to by Democrats and Republicans alike forever. But Bernie comes along and offers an alternative, and we're going to bring in millions of people to the electoral process through this means. Unfortunately, it didn't really work for Bernie. either in 2016 or in 2020. You could see here that Bernie didn't expand the electorate in 2016. This is public opinion data from the American Panel Survey, which shows that Bernie didn't have any more success in mobilizing non-voters than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. And further, there's a fair amount of evidence that this has been a problem for Democratic Party insurgent candidates in the past running the Democratic Party primaries. Jesse Jackson, for instance, both in 1984 and 1988, when he ran for president in the Democratic Party primaries, his campaign has been studied by political scientists, and they found that it had no effect whatsoever on the size of the electorate, even among African Americans, which were his core base at the time. So changing the size of the electorate is very, very, very difficult. And we need to confront this problem, and we need to think about how to overcome it, because it's a crucial, crucial problem that we face. And I'm going to talk about how we might do that in a minute. Second, even if we bring a huge new wave of voters into the electorate, sort of non-voting working class folks, the reality is that most successful insurgent candidates right now, for reasons that Dustin will get into tomorrow, so I know that they're there and they're important to talk about, but I'm going to bracket them. Most of those candidates are going to run on the Democratic Party ballot line. And this means we have to confront a second major challenge, which is the sort of nature of the Democratic Party itself. And in particular, the way in which the Democratic Party disciplines candidates to basically toe the centrist line being spouted by top donors and the establishment leadership. So on the one hand, the Democratic Party isn't really even a party in the way that we ordinarily think of them. You don't actually register to become a member of the party directly with the party, as is the case in almost every country in the world. Rather, you register with the state, where you just like check off a little box when you get your driver's license saying, I'm going to register as a Democrat or Republican. A lot of states, you don't even register at all. And you can just vote in whichever primary you want. Most countries, parties, you have to become a member. You don't do that in the United States. You don't pay dues to parties in the United States, unlike almost all other membership organizations, like unions, for instance. And there's also no strong ideological orientation to the Democratic Party. It's just this massive coalition of widely divergent interests and ideological commitments that just sort of is knit together in this really loose sort of way. And this is why it's so easy for insurgents like Bernie to effectively use the Democratic Party ballot line, which is that we have this open primary system and this very decentralized party that makes the party seem vulnerable to left-wing takeover. And in fact, in some ways, it is. Indeed, there are a lot of strong reasons given by progressives, our allies, for why taking over the party infrastructure makes sense. And despite the argument I'm about to make about the importance of building an independent organizational structure, we should engage with those ideas seriously, because our relationship to the Democratic Party, it shouldn't be a matter of principle, but rather of tactics. That is, what works to build working class power. So all that said, the other really important thing to consider is that even though the Democratic Party seems sort of porous and open, the National Party is very centralized and has become increasingly so over the last few decades. The last few decades have seen a massive increase in the amount of money that's been used in electoral campaigns and an increasing dependence on the fundraising from the super rich. That's happened for a number of reasons that Dustin's going to get into tomorrow, I think, which are really interesting. But for the time being, let's just take that as given. For instance, in 1980, the top donors of the 0.01% of income earners donated $1.72 million to federal elections. Whereas in 2012, the top two donors, who were Sheldon Adelson and his wife Miriam, gave alone $56.8 million and $46.6 respectively. And as a result of this massive increase in electoral spending, parties are raising a lot more money than they used to. For instance, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the group that fundraises for the House, for the Democratic Party, spent about $14 million in 1992 and $300 million in 2018. And so basically what's happening is the party establishment is using this money to discipline candidates. Candidates need the endorsement of the DCCC, that's the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They need the endorsement of key donors in the party in order to be competitive electorally. This is something that's actually documented really well in Ryan Grimm's recent book. If people want to check it out, it's a very, very good book to read to learn sort of how this works. You have to get the Democratic Party establishment's endorsements in order to raise a lot of money. And they want you to be able to raise a lot of money so that you can hire really expensive Democratic Party aligned consultants that can make sure that you keep on message during the campaign, right? And so the effect of all of this, increasing concentration of decision-making power about the purse strings around the sort of top leadership of the Democratic Party and top donors, has been to basically discipline cash-poor candidates. Even the most earnest progressives are susceptible to this. They have to do more or less, they have to stay in line with what the sort of leadership of the party and top donors want, or else they're not going to get the money that they need, right? So if we hope to overcome this problem and to shield our candidates from some of these pressures, we need to find a way to make sure that our candidates don't have to depend on those sorts of funding and on that disciplining from within the Democratic Party. So basically, Dustin, who we'll talk tomorrow, and I have talked about the idea of a party surrogate to address some of these issues. This is something that would be really similar to like an independent or third political party, but the big difference the first big difference is that it would run candidates in the Democratic Party primaries, not on its own ballot line. And again, Dustin's going to get into all the reasons of why that makes sense, but I just want to bracket that for now. And also, the other big difference is that a party surrogate like we're talking about wouldn't act like a traditional U.S. party, like those I was mentioning, like when I was describing the Democratic Party. So let me talk about what would make it different, and then for a couple of minutes explain why that would be so useful to make us more competitive electorally. So if you see here, I have a chart just sort of like looking at traditional parties like the Democratic and Republican parties. They have a set of characteristics. They try to get politics done through elite negotiation rather than sort of mass mobilization or pressuring from the outside based on mass support. They try to avoid having a very clear political position on as many things as they can. That's what they're called catch-all parties, because they want to be able to get as many constituencies as they can to support them, regardless of the ideological compromises they have to make along the way. Membership doesn't really mean very much. It's sort of intermittent. It just happens during, as I was saying with the Democrats and Republicans, you're just sort of like filling out a form one time and then maybe go vote. You don't really feel a sense of commitment at all to the party. These parties are financed by donors, not by members, which means that there's no accountability to the membership. It's just accountability to the top donors. The type of party surrogate that we're talking about would be the opposite of all those qualities you can see here. Instead of building a theory of how we're going to create political change based on elite negotiation, it's based on mass mobilization and pressure from below. Instead of having a very ill-defined ideological program, we want a clearly defined, very specific program for working class empowerment that we can use to hold our candidates accountable to the base, to the membership of the party. The structure would not be determined, decisions wouldn't be determined at the top by the leadership of a small group of basically unaccountable donors and top party leaders, but rather democratically, in every local chapter, making democratic decisions and sending delegates to democratic state and national committees. A membership would mean something. Membership would mean, you want to be a part of this organization because it's fighting for a vision of a different society that you care about. And so it's not just sort of this intermittent, sort of weak attachment that we see with the Democrats and Republicans. And member dues rather than donors fund the organization, which means that the people that lead the organization have to be accountable to the membership in a way that you don't see with these traditional parties. What are examples of this? Well, to a certain extent, you could say, and I think it's true, that the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, Our Revolution, Justice Democrats, Working Families Party, the Richmond Progressive Alliance, if you'll know what that is, from Richmond, California. There's a lot of examples of organizations that are sort of like this, but I would argue that none of them certainly have the national scale that we will be talking about, nor the level of coordination or membership accountability of the sort of organization that we look like. And so we will be talking about building an organization that sort of builds on those different experiences of organizations that I just meant to create something like this, that could be competitive at the national level. And so I'm sort of going over my time. Just give me like 2 more minutes, just to say how this would work. Oh, sorry, Bhaskar, do you want to say something? Okay, so let me just sort of explain like why it makes sense in terms of like overcoming these problems of sort of the disciplining effects that the Democratic Party has on political candidates, and also on this problem of voter mobilization. So as I sort of mentioned already, the money and discipline problems can be overcome because even though our people won't have the same kind of money that establishment Democrats have, although Bernie's fundraising models show we can actually raise a fair amount of money, we're going to have an army of these committed, mobilized activists, many of whom, hopefully all of you that are, or many of you that are watching, were those people in the Bernie campaign or on campaigns for state reps or congressional campaigns, where you really care about the organization you're fighting for, and you're willing to go out there and hit the pavement, knock doors. And that can sort of balance the differential in terms of, we don't have the money, but we have the ground game. We have the people that can get those voter identifications, that can win those votes, and make up for the differential in financing. Also, candidates don't want to betray the party platform when they depend completely on our organization for their success. Because if they try to cut deals and they try to betray the commitments that they've made to us, then we're simply not going to continue supporting them in the future. And since they've already kind of burned a lot of their bridges with other sources of funding from top Democrats and major party donors by saying they're never going to take corporate contributions, et cetera, they don't really have anywhere else to turn. So there are very strong incentives for these candidates to stick to the platform of the party and to stay accountable to the base of the party. Finally, there's a couple other things to say about that, but I just want to close by talking a little bit about voter mobilization and voter engagement. How do we deal with this problem of voter mobilization, and how could a party surrogate help? There's no sort of magic bullet for dealing with this problem, but I think that a party surrogate could be useful because we're not just going to be organizing during election cycles, we're going to be organizing throughout the year. We're going to be doing movement work, Green New Deal, Medicare for All, et cetera, that connects our electoral work to organizing projects around core issues that are most important to working people. And so that's the way we're going to build more trust. That's the way that we're going to build all these connections that we need to build among sort of non-voting working class people, is to have this year-round connection and show more and more people that the electoral campaigns that we're working on are actually just a tool for helping to achieve these really, really critical goals in terms of the policy goals that we're talking about, and that there's basically no real difference between movement work and electoral work. It's all part of the same process. And there's been a lot of work, studies that have been done, and experiments that have been done by different grassroots organizations around the country, so like Make the Road, Engage, Scope, and in lots of different communities, which have shown that doing this kind of work is actually very effective in increasing voter turnout among non-voters. And there's a lot of reasons why this didn't really work for Sanders and for some Sanders candidates, but it doesn't mean that we should abandon the broader strategy. There's still a lot of potential there. And I think one thing that people should really be doing a lot of, as you're sitting at home and you're bored and you want to know what to do, I have a great idea for you. Go online, and there's a lot of different databases you can use, but try to find the districts, precincts where Sanders and Sanders-style candidates have done really, really well, and we've actually seen increased turnout, because there are a lot of them. And we need to start thinking about and like reading up on and talking to the organizers from these places to figure out why were those experiences successful, and to try to devise new strategies to engage the sort of voters, potential voters that we're going to need to really continue the political revolution. So I will stop there and look forward to hearing some folks' questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Jared. So just as a reminder to everyone, we have a bunch of questions in. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure how many more we could take, but please toss a question or two if you really have a burning one, and I'll try to get to it. Once again, Jared's a writer for both Catalyst and Jacobin. Please check out his work. If you want the longer form version, you should read it in Catalyst. It's called A Socialist Party in Our Time, with a question mark. from I think 1 or 2 issues ago in Catalyst, and I don't believe it's paywalled. And if it is paywalled, then there's a version in the description too on the Jacobin site, which is definitely not. And I really do want to make one last reminder that if you like the video, if you're watching right now, just press like, press subscribe. It helps us reach other people, so that these conversations aren't just the conversations among friends that we've been having for many years in the socialist movement, and start to become larger and larger conversations. So, Jared, there's a bunch of questions. So if there's any that you feel like you can't tackle in a short amount of time, or might be better to hold off till later, you could just say pass, and I'm sure no one will be offended. Um, so I'll start with one question that's about the regional aspect of your strategy that was mentioned in both of your pieces, the Catalyst piece and the Jacobin piece. Can you just explain a little bit more?
Sure.
That is it just demographics? Is what is it about in particular the Southwest that you think is makes it more fertile than maybe it might seem from the outside?
Okay, yeah, great. So I did, yeah, obviously didn't have time to get into this. Part of what we were talking about is like the party surrogate's going to have to think, well, not going to have to, but we think it would be a good idea if it started to think really strategically about building a political heartland somewhere. And this is the way that a lot of Labor Party, socialist parties, throughout history and around the world have grown initially, is to build a lot of strength in a particular part of the country, and then sort of ratchet up from there along the way. And we can go into the mechanics of why that's useful, but basically to talk about the specific region that you mentioned, we were thinking, it makes sense to focus our electoral efforts to the extent that we can, and recognizing that there's going to be great electoral campaigns in New York and California. We're not saying that people should drop everything and not do those things, but what we really need to be doing is trying to find places where we can win these larger sort of like working class constituencies. And we thought that the best places to do that would be places, number one, well, there's a lot of things that we've sort of looked into and sort of like built some like sort of crude models to like think through how this might work. Like where does Sanders get a lot of support? Where are places where there are relatively significant levels of sort of progressive infrastructure already? Where is there relatively high levels of unionization? Where are there relatively high percentages of sort of like working class people in general? And a number of other characteristics we could talk more about. And we basically decided or came up with the idea that sort of concentrating, if we could just sort of like shake a crystal ball and say like let's do this, we would think it would make sense to sort of focus our efforts somewhere like in the Midwest or in the Southwest, where sort of the confluence of all these different factors that we talked about seems to be sort of most propitious, rather than say on the coasts, where we think that even though there's a lot of strength of sort of like really, really progressive movements already, that we wouldn't be able to build the same kind of movement among working class folks.
So we organize everywhere, you organize wherever you are, but if we have a national organization, that national organization is going to direct extra resources to certain areas. And here are reasons why these particular areas might be huge areas of growth. In the same way that 105 years ago, the Socialist Party's areas of strength were, scattered across the country, but from the Western states where capitalism was still very violent and not a bit more unsettled, to enclaves or largely immigrant enclaves in New York and other places, and so on. So, this is something that socialist organizations and unions do too, which is, operate from the principle that everybody is of the same moral importance, but there are certain people that are better strategically positioned to take those organizing resources and actually make a national impact. All right, so one quick question, which is, don't habitual non-voters soon become non-registered? Wouldn't we need wholesale registration drives? That didn't work well under Jackson. So I assume referring to Jesse Jackson's two campaigns. Do you have new ideas or opportunities, or do we have new ideas or opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think definitely we would need to have a pretty serious focus on voter registration, which I hope we're focusing a lot on in the next few months, or leading up to the election in November. But I think that that's not enough, right? I mean, it's very important, and I'm really glad you brought that up. But we also need to be thinking about how to engage communities and engage folks in this sort of like ongoing way that I mentioned, and try to show folks through different sorts of creative organizing, you know, the connections between the electoral work we're doing, the movement work we're doing, and their daily lives. And voter registration is a big piece of that. But I think the ongoing, sort of like slow building of new constituencies through this kind of like year-round electoral / movement work is really going to be the way to succeed. I mean, it's not, Sanders was a magic bullet for a little while, right? And now that's gone. And, now we're back to sort of like the slow, hard, process of building these movements. And I think that, we have so many more resources than we did before to make this happen. We have tons of opportunities, but it's still going to be tough, and it's still going to be slow, and there's no magic bullet.
All right, here's one more question. So I'm sold on the strategy, the questioner puts it.
Well, wonderful.
Yeah, so we should just leave it there. So how do we do this? Who's going to found this party surrogate? How do I join? Where's Bernie to sell this to all his flake supporters? LOL. I guess I was supposed to laugh. So I guess to add to that, okay, so we have DSA, we have all these different little organizations. We have organizations that might not have a mass membership base, but certainly have people that are doing things broadly in the tent. Is the next organization we need just a version of DSA that's bigger, broader tent, less sectarian, just has more people in it? It's kind of a catch-all. And I assume all the other existing organizations can stay and still exist, but we just need an umbrella. Is that basically it? Or do we need something else?
I mean, I think it's sort of an open question as to like whether, I mean, let's preface this by saying like none of us here, well, maybe somebody that's watching, and if you do, then let's talk, have really any real influence with Sanders or the people around him. So a lot of this will depend on what Sanders himself did. But if, and sort of people that are, much more influential within the campaign and that his orbit than most of us are, I think that basically what we'd be talking about is building something that is either a coalition or maybe even a new organization that we sort of merge into, but certainly a coalition where you have basically a platform that's relatively direct and relatively short that everybody can sort of agree on, and you have a merging of resources, and you have strategic conversations among all the different groups that are going to come together here to sort of talk about like what is a realistic goal for next election cycle, for the election cycle after that, and then we sort of hash through what what a realistic set of focuses should be. And I think that this would basically be, this can't be just DSA. DSA is, I think, too narrow, and I think that all these groups are too narrow, and that it has to be something that is not, it's probably not going to be called a Democratic Socialist Organization. Well, maybe it'll be called Democratic Socialist, but it will be more like Democratic Socialist in the Bernie sense of like social democrat rather than, sort of a more hardline sort of socialism. And I think that, it's going to have to be all these groups together, plus sort of merging all of the sort of like local Bernie groups that have sprung up over the last, year or so. And we're just going to have to build, something like a combination of, the different strategies that our revolution, DSA, Working Families Party have, and come together and try to come up with something that works. It's not going to be, we're going to all have to make compromises. If we did something like this, it's not going to be, the ideal organization. It's going to be based on negotiation and compromise. But I think that together, we can take advantage of this sort of unprecedented opportunity to keep all of those Bernie people engaged. There's tens of thousands of Bernie people who see electoral organizing as the main place to do their work. And if we don't get them plugged into something new and big right now, then we might lose that energy. And we don't, if we keep them engaged electorally, then eventually they'll start doing movement work. Eventually they'll start, doing all kinds of other, connecting with other types of organizations, and they'll become lifelong activists. And we need that to happen now. And I think the only way to make sure we can capitalize that on a grand scale is to sort of combine our forces. Now, obviously, I have no say in making that happen. But if anybody, I plead with all of the folks watching, to talk with everybody about sort of trying to make something like this happen, because I think this is an opportunity that we have right now, because the Sanders campaign is relatively recent, but it's not going to last for much longer.
Yeah, the Sanders campaign, the Sanders movement needs an institution to continue its political revolution, so we could actually go forward, and also presumably go forward using Sanders and his platform now, with the knowledge that Sanders is an older guy. He's not going to run again in 4 years. He's not going to run again in 8 years. So we obviously need new candidates. We need a new base of activists. And for those of us on the far left, for those of us in DSA, we need a sea to swim in. Otherwise, we'll just kind of turn back into ourselves and kind of be swallowed up by all sorts of, forms of sectarianism and kind of the inward lookingness of a group that's getting smaller, as opposed to what we've seen over the past few years, which have been so inspiring, which is a growing group that more and more is looking outward at the world and more thinking about how do we actually transform things. So a related question would be one about the class composition of the party surrogate. So presumably this is obviously, the goal is to make this into some sort of working class political formation.
Yeah.
But when we think about the groups of people that are actually active in existing organizations, and not just DSA, I'm talking about, but even our revolution chapters in places where our revolution is extremely active and big, like around,
here in Somerville, yeah.
yeah, in Somerville and Cambridge, places like that. This is movements largely dominated by middle class people, and I don't even mean that in a derogative way. It's just, the movement's small, and it just so happens that college educated people with a little bit of a surplus of time, have played a big role keeping alive the flame of left liberal thought and left liberal practice in the United States. So in the short term, I imagine this will just be a larger version of the same dynamic, with just an aspiration through rhetoric and program and organizing to reach working people. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to start with what we have, right? And I mean, but to be fair to us, I mean, like most socialist and labor parties historically have started with a middle class base that expanded into the working class. So it's not like this would be an unprecedented thing. But I do think it's a real question about, like, I don't know if people are familiar with the Data for Progress, or Scott McElwee, the guy that leads it. I have a lot of critiques.
Sean
McKelvey.
Yeah,
sorry.
That's like the biggest insult, because this guy fucking loves himself. He just named his new think tank SEAN think tank. So
Sean, I didn't mean if he's trolling this conversation, I didn't mean anything by it.
He has shooters everywhere, man. You got to be careful.
But
I would close that window after this talk.
But the point is that even though I disagree with his take on things, I think that he actually has a real strategy for how progressives can win that is relatively coherent, which is based on basically abandoning this talk of trying to mobilize non-voters and abandoning basically trying to build a working class base, and just saying we can build progressive force in Congress and in state legislatures based on the backs of basically super liberal urban folks and sort of moderate liberal suburban people. And I think we have to engage with that more, because these are we can say all that we want, and I've said a bunch of things about how I think that's not the right way to go, but his strategy is working better than ours in a lot of ways, right? And so I think we need to figure out how to justify our strategy in more like based on sounder theoretical grounds. And so I think that part of that is, number one, there's a couple of reasons why we don't want to focus on um, the PMC, or the professional managerial class, rather than the working class. And I think one of them is that basically we don't think, number one, that a constituency that's PMC focused is ultimately going to be as reliable of a constituency for the very strong redistributive measures that we're talking about in the long run. That there's something to be said for the sort of like coincidence of material interests between working class people and the politics that we're talking about. That is not the case for many folks in the professional managerial class, who are sort of shielded from a lot of the more negative effects of global capitalism by sort of their position in the labor force, which is highly skilled, and they're much more scarce jobs. Or excuse me, like they're jobs that are sort of like more immune from sort of the vagaries of the global market more than some other jobs, although not entirely. So that's number one, is that we just think that the working class constituency makes more sense in terms of having a base and a constituency that is going to press for the major democratic socialist redistributive mechanisms that we're talking about. And number two, I think from a sort of broader electoral perspective, they're just simply, and I'm writing something about this now, and I was just doing some data, or just analyzing some stuff on this in the last few days, and like we just cannot win a majority nationally of districts in Congress based on a PMC strategy. There's just not enough places where you have enough of those folks to win a majority. Like obviously we can win a lot of places with them, and that's fine, and we should do that. But unless we start engaging working class districts that are predominantly working class, much more than we're doing right now, we're not going to be able to build a majoritarian coalition that can take on either centrist Democrats or the right. Like it's just a matter of necessity that we start trying to build enclaves and inroads into these into communities that are much more working class than the ones that we progressives have been focusing on right now, if we hope to have a viable majoritarian strategy electorally over the longer term. So those are sort of like the strategic material interest side of who's going to be most interested in pressing for our sort of redistributive agenda, and then the other side is the sort of like political electoral map just not matching up to building a sort of majoritarian coalition on the back of a PMC strategy. There's a lot of other things we could talk about here, but I hope that folks start or continue to have these sorts of conversations. I think this is like a really, really, really crucial question that we haven't like engaged with seriously enough as the sort of Sanders left.
But to be fair to McElway and these other people, their goal is a set of progressive policies. To some extent, there's overlap on some of those policies, not all of them, with our immediate kind of set of demands. But our more fundamental goal is to organize the working class.
Right.
And by organizing workers, certain objective organic demands would follow that organization. So our goals are fundamentally political and not policy oriented. So I do think, to be fair, he's trying to reassemble an existing, kind of situation to achieve a certain end, which, from the standpoint of a liberal guy working for think tank kind of oriented, makes perfect sense. I think I was probably a little bit unfair there, but obviously, even if we couldn't build a majority with working class politics, which I definitely think is not true. I think we can build a majority that way. It would still be our pursuit. Okay, so one question: which unions have weak relationships with the Democratic Party? Could we win any of them over, especially in city states dominated by Dems? I guess maybe you could take us more broadly to the question of winning over institutional labor and its importance. One interesting thing that I just thought of was, even in Minneapolis, when Ty Moore, the socialist alternative candidate, was running his campaign against a Democrat, I do not believe that was. I think that was a partisan race, not a nonpartisan race. Like Seattle, for instance, is a nonpartisan race. A lot of the local races in the country, especially west of the Mississippi. I guess Minneapolis is probably right east of Mississippi, are non-partisan races. I think this was a partisan race in which a lot of the major unions actually decided to discipline Democrats by endorsing this far left candidate. But I guess just in general, what do you think about institutional labor, and where can we break off most easily, and how important is it?
Well, I think it's really important, and I think that I don't have great answers in terms of how to accomplish that goal. I think that there's probably a lot of people watching, or other folks that even Dustin tomorrow would have a lot of good ideas about this. But I don't think we've seen a lot of great solutions from anybody, really. I mean, I think basically this is another really big problem. Like, we need to have labor support in order for something like this to work. It's absolutely essential. I mean, there's never been a Labor Party or a Socialist Party that's been particularly successful without having, pretty serious institutional labor support, even if they didn't have the support of like the mainstream unions in a given country. And I think that, it's very promising that, we have seen some unions come out and support Sanders, obviously like the nurses union, postal workers union, and a lot of locals, of different internationals, have come out in support of Sanders. And I personally think that, and I'd love to read great accounts that other people have of this question, but my basic sense is that the only way that we're going to get more unions to support the kind of stuff that we're talking about is if the leadership sees it as in their interest to do this. And that could either happen by, number one, just having a lot more pressure from the union base, that they want to have more accountable sort of primary processes or union endorsement processes, and sort of pressuring their union leadership to take stronger stands. Or it could also just come from eventually, you see, like you just talked about in Minneapolis, like sometimes Democrats just go a bridge too far in the neoliberal direction, and it just it harms the sort of basic material interests of even very risk averse union bureaucrats, and so they're willing to buck the establishment Democratic Party. But there's not a ton of examples of that happening, and there's very, very strong incentives for union leaderships to not do that. And so I think it's going to have to come in sort of fits and starts, sort of from the bottom up. And I think the more successful, this is the other thing, is the more successful we are, the more successful Sanders style politics are in getting people elected to Congress, State House, and municipal offices. We're going to be able to show more and more union, both membership and leadership, that we actually are serious, and that we actually have the capacity to deliver things to them that would benefit them in serious ways. And the more and more we can do that, the more and more serious the conversations about supporting something like this are going to be among, especially progressive unions, and maybe eventually, more mainstream unions.
That's a great place to end it. We're already 3 minutes over, but I will end it with another question instead, which probably will lead us to a worse place to end it. But it is a good, earnest question that just came in the chat, or came in a bit earlier, which is, what do you think about strategies involving working within both major parties, like running socialists as Republicans in Alabama, or hijacking dead local parties in blue or red party states, kind of one party states? And I guess if we are in fact using the ballot line instrumentally, which would mean in certain areas we could avoid the question where there's nonpartisan races, local levels.
The majority of them, yeah.
Yeah, majority of those local races. But what about using primaries in other areas? I imagine your objection would be, my objection isn't one of principle. It just seems like a very complicated thing to try to do. So even, for example, in Alabama, yes, Alabama is a red state, but it also has, in those black belt counties, it also has whole counties that are majority black, where there's low turnout, but where, to the extent people are registered and are voting for progressive measures, are voting as Democrats. So to me, it would be kind of surrendering to that electoral college calculus a bit too much. And also it would be kind of complicated to explain to people. So that's my kind of practical objection. But I don't know. What do you think about this? This has been floated by a few people.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what Brand New Congress's original plan was, right? You know, and I think that in addition to the critiques that you had, I mean, oh, we should also remember that like back in the day, this was very common that like the nonpartisan league or farmer labor parties like and socialists back in the earlier 20th century would run candidates in both party primaries. Like that was a thing that they did. But I think now it makes less sense for the reasons that Busker mentioned, but also because, I mean, strategically, we just don't have enough resources to run like candidates everywhere. And I think that we have so many opportunities to run candidates, based on the limited resources that we have in Democratic Party primaries, where I think just like from a political perspective, it would be much easier for us to win, a majority primary coalition than it would be in Republican primaries, where we're going to have to be facing obviously strong pressures to, tone down a lot of the like very important, progressive policies that we believe in order to win those primaries. It seems like that's not as strategically useful a thing to do as focusing on Democratic primaries. I mean, unless your strategic focus is an organization that just wants to, get as many Democrats or non-absolutely terrible, terrible, terrible Republicans elected. If that's your strategy, then I think that makes sense. Like it would be better to have somebody who's like sort of terrible, who's a Republican, rather than somebody who's like absolutely the worst ever. But as Democratic Socialists and as progressives, like that's not our goal. We're not trying to, get folks in the office who are a little bit worse or a little bit less bad than other folks. We're actually trying to build a bold, progressive, working class Democratic Socialist core of elected officials. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense to focus on Republican primaries in order to
If
do that.
we were 25 times larger,
Yeah, exactly.
and we could credibly run, we had that many candidates. It's essentially like our junior candidate that we were training in a district would run in the Republican,
Right.
primary, and the other one would run in the Democrat.
That would be great.
But to be perfectly honest, like that would maybe make sense if there was open primaries everywhere. I mean, there's just a lot of, I think,
Right.
practical objections to it beyond even kind of the broader kind of a moral question of maybe like potentially abandoning voters if you're not running Democrats in certain red states.
But don't worry, everybody. We have plenty of races to run in Democratic Party and independent races, so we're not going to run out of races.
Remind me of the percentage of elected offices that socialists and the left more broadly hold.
0.01. So we have
0.01.
99.9% of offices to win. So we got some opportunities.
All right. So just of the couple hundred people who are tuning in live to this, if they, go out there and do something, you could actually make a major impact on the American socialist movement. That's one of the beautiful things about being a socialist in the U.S. We are so small. We are so historically defeated and historically weak that, in fact, this is, a time when actually we can make history. We can make more progress than our movement has in the last 40 years. We could do that in the next few years if we really commit ourselves to a strategy that works. And I just want to thank Jared for taking all this time and for writing these articles. It's really important to put your ideas out there. Obviously, some people are going to be critical of certain aspects or whatnot, but this is what a active, vibrant movement does. Thinks about strategy. It has debates about strategies. It tries to apply those strategies in the real world. Then we'll see the results and we'll adjust as we we see what's going on. And just as a reminder to everyone else, my last and final appeal of the night: we're not asking you for money. We will ask you for money in December, especially the way this year is going with the recession. If those able, we would hope you help out our December fundraiser. But in the meantime, just please press the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. Please tune in tomorrow. We're going to continue the conversation with Jared's co-author, Dustin. And we have a bunch of other great programming here, 6 p.m. almost every evening. So please do, tune in. And I, hope everyone stays safe and has a great rest of the week. And Jared, I'll see you sometime soon. We're only about a mile away from each other right now, so hopefully I will see you, and be 6 feet away from you at some point soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Bhaskar.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.